Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Aishika Bhattacharya and I'll be your moderator for the session. Today we are presenting step-by-step approach to establish a successful supplier relationship management program by David Atkinson. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. At any point in time, you may send us your questions in the Q&A box and they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. Introducing Zycus. Zycus is a leading global provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement performance solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and the operational aspects of procurement. Zycus has been recognized as a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for Strategic Sourcing Application Suites for 3 years in a row. Today we have with us David Atkinson, who has over 2 decades of experience in procurement in consumer goods, automotive, and aerospace sectors. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to you, David.
Thanks, Ashika. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is David Atkinson. For those that don't know me, I've been in and around the procurement profession for over 30 years, starting as a buyer at Black & Decker, before leading procurement organizations in the automotive and aerospace sectors, including Rolls-Royce. Now, since my practitioner's days, I've focused on providing consulting advice and training and coaching to international clients in many different business sectors, such as pharma, transport, oil and gas, manufacturing, and many others. Between times, I also lecture to MBA students at the University of Birmingham Business School, and occasionally other institutions too, all through my business 4 pillars. I'm also an experienced practitioner and long-time student of negotiation practice, and I'm an accredited trainer from the Harvard-MIT program on negotiation. And I'm acutely aware of the challenges involved in securing and sustaining a supplier network that is genuinely and highly motivated towards helping the buying organization achieve its commercial goals. My interest in SRM goes back many years, in particular my experiences in aerospace and automotive. And a particular feature of those sectors is that after careful selection of the suppliers, because sometimes these suppliers are on the platform for many, many years, it often feels to the procurement practitioner very difficult, if not impossible, to switch suppliers once the program goes live. So they've got really little option than to work proactively with suppliers to improve performance and value. And they do so without that luxury of being able to threaten to resource the business to an alternative supplier. So in this environment, getting the best out of suppliers is very demanding, as from a negotiation perspective, suppliers are often well aware of the limited options open to the buyer. Since my practitioner days, I've since further developed my interest in SRM, as well as continuing to improve my expertise in the wider procurement field. And I believe that a pragmatic, systematic, and demanding approach to SRM, as well as procurement in general, is preferable to a reliance on goodwill and the naively optimistic notion of partnering. And it is sometimes naive. I also work extensively with sales leaders and account managers on the supply side, and their frustrations with procurement are deep and wide. And it's often remarked that efforts at collaboration are one-sided, and that buyers simply resort to applying price down pressure as soon as the collaboration effort becomes too complicated and costly time-wise, So my intention in this webinar is to challenge your thinking on what constitutes an effective SRM program and to provide some guidance to those seeking to make improvements in that work. My goal is about helping people understand how ready our organizations are to give us a fighting chance of being successful in implementing SRM. At the heart of my argument is the idea that there's no point designing an SRM program if your organization lacks the competency and capacity to deliver it. I will add that simply training people in supplier management without an agreed SRM method or strategy is a route to wasting your precious training budget. So the topics I intend to cover are why SRM matters, why it's become or becoming a core business procurement competence, the skills required to do it well, and it's a broad range of skills, a pragmatic yet systematic SRM process involving fundamental readiness components, a sequential process for developing strategy, and a method for engaging suppliers. And then finally, getting started, how to make it happen, some guidance on ensuring your SRM program is respected, it's supported, and it truly begins to deliver value. So let me start with why SRM matters. With high dependency on supply inputs, usually around 70% these days on the cost of goods, then the ability to optimize value from the supply chain is absolutely crucial. Indeed, if you're in a low margin business that's reliant on third-party supply, then if it isn't competent at sourcing an SRM, it won't have a sustainable business model, and any competitive advantage that it may have built up may well be eroded over time. Furthermore, the ability to forensically analyze and then improve the sources of cost and value are critical to procurement's value proposition to the business. Add to that the ability to identify and work with suppliers who can offer a pipeline of innovative ideas is key to ensuring the business and its suppliers have a positive future. And before anyone finds themselves suspicious of this rather deterministic or even rosy case for SRM, think of the consequences of doing SRM poorly. Rising supply input prices, real or relative to competitors' own input costs, the cost of intervening to resolve service, delivery, or quality issues, and poor relationship behaviors that erode trust and the potential for collaboration. You don't have to look very far to uncover cases of organizations getting SRM wrong and suffering the consequences of bad practice and neglect. That usually has a big impact on the bottom line and to the reputation of the organization. So I believe SRM is really potentially going to become one of the genuinely core business competencies in our organizations. And I think it potentially affects everyone, not just those in a procurement role. So I also believe that will influence the procurement role itself in the future, with as much attention being applied to the later stages of category management as to the earlier, more familiar sourcing-focused ones. So the role of procurement, I think, will become one of educator and coach to colleagues and stakeholders and cross-functional teams who will, in ideal circumstances, jointly manage supplier relationships. So I'm going to talk about skills now. So before I kind of get into a little bit more detail, I just want to say that I think the procurement profession has had a debate for some time now on the optimum balance between technical and procurement skills, and those of a more interpersonal nature. More recently, I think there's been a compelling case made for interpersonal skills being those that really make the difference to success for procurement. Others that say that technical skills are always going to remain important, as without them, procurement is offering no unique expertise, merely being seen as helpful colleagues. So I'm not here to argue for one side or the other, as I think it's a false dichotomy. I think both are important. But what is important in my view is what is valued by stakeholders. And this has implications for their support, involvement, and potentially the leadership of key supplier relationships. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to highlight the key attributes and skill requirements for those leading and participating in SRM, but for now, I'll highlight what I consider to be the most important. One, to be customer-centric. That is the ability and the desire to engage stakeholders, to sell SRM as a concept, a method, a way of working that requires the active involvement of people from around the business. What's important is that whatever is done under the banner of SRM must resonate and have a positive impact on stakeholders and how they execute their jobs. So procurement leaders should think about their team's consulting skills and how they can demonstrate their enthusiastic interest in the needs of those stakeholders. Secondly, technical competence to facilitate the deep analysis required to understand what drives the relationship with each supplier and the extent to which the buying organization can motivate and lead the supplier into the sort of collaboration that will deliver value improvement. And I'll say more about that in a moment or two. Thirdly, strategic competence. That's the ability to construct a relationship strategy that takes account of dependencies, and rather than just simply creating a wish list of good ideas, this is going to be essential to practitioners responsible for creating better category strategies and relationship strategies. 4, project management. Kind of obvious one, but this is essential to ensure effective implementation, all the while then ensuring that stakeholders play their part in that. And then finally, engaging suppliers to get things done, creating value through the application of technical and persuasion skills to get suppliers to work diligently to help you achieve your aims. And this is key to ensuring that your SRM endeavors bear fruit. Therefore, the question for leaders really is, to what extent do my people have the skills to lead SRM internally and then with key suppliers? And if not, how do we get there? So I want to move on and talk a little bit now about the second topic, which is around SRM readiness. Before we get too focused on the skills, I'd like to highlight the requirements for any organization that seeks to become effective in deploying SRM by covering the components that indicate readiness. Good intentions are not enough. The organizations need to be ready to do SRM, or efforts will be piecemeal. May I suggest 6-3-3 model? So here there are 6 readiness components that provide the bedrock of any SRM program. Without these, the CPO will struggle to embed good practice. Then there are 3 steps to creating relationship strategies, which is similar in nature to the sales approach of developing customer account plans. Without a relationship strategy, your efforts and engagement will lack precision and may be ineffective. And because what method works in one relationship won't necessarily work in another. So we have to have discrete strategies for the most important relationships. And thirdly, supplier engagement itself. It has 3 tiers in my view. Number 1 is about protecting the value that you've contracted for. So that is performance and contract management. Number 2, developing value through direct intervention in the supplier's business and method of operation. And 3, value transformation, which is where innovation capture becomes a priority. So let's talk about the first 6 readiness components. Number 1 is actually having an SRM process itself with appropriate tools and templates. In other words, an agreed method that people can understand and can work with. It should be systematic, repeatable, modulated depending on how important the supplier relationship is, and moreover, data-driven. It will cover 2 key phases of activity: the development of a relationship strategy for each key supplier, and then supplier engagement, how the organization will lead and collaborate with the supplier to secure value improvements. Secondly, there is the performance indicators and a method of tracking benefits. Excuse me, I'm getting some noise here. Can everyone hear okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Does anyone have any question? You can, let us know in the Q&A box if you have any questions. Okay, I think David, you can continue.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So let's getting back to performance indicators and the method of tracking benefits. Although obviously the CPO and anyone else involved is going to be careful not to overpromise, you've got to track progress. Otherwise, your program will lack credibility. So you've really got to ensure that everyone involved in SRM is focused on delivering tangible improvement. If nothing else, the CFO will demand it in exchange for supporting the investment required to launch and embed SRM. Thirdly, organizational SRM competence. This is something I've touched upon already, of course, and I'm going to return to it again. But it's important that team members, including non-procurement staff, have enough commercial nous to enable them to interface with suppliers and see that relationships are a means to an end. In other words, that the name of the game is securing optimum value for money and not simply pursue harmonious relationships. I'm still getting some extraneous noise here on this line. So I know if anyone else can mute their microphone, I'd appreciate it, please. So in order to deploy that competence effectively, then just like category management, SRM is a cross-functional endeavor, ideally. Particularly in the sourcing and management of services, stakeholder budget holders are often best placed to provide oversight of and guidance to suppliers. And it certainly makes sense to involve them in the shaping of the relationship strategy. It also provides an opportunity to educate them in ways of procurement. However, cross-functional working must be supported by leaders. Supply-based segmentation is essential. No organization has the capacity to intensively manage and intervene its whole portfolio of suppliers. Can someone mute the microphone, please? So a robust segmentation method needs to be in place. This is about prioritizing your key suppliers to enable you to focus on the ones that are most business critical and or offer the best opportunity to improve value. And finally, a program and a phased implementation plan. And that is to ensure that the program rollout is doable. Big bang approach is too ambitious for most organizations, so thinking pragmatically, choices have to be made on how many suppliers will get the intensive SRM treatment and when. The number could be as low as 5 or 6 in the first year before the program builds up a head of steam beyond that. Once leaders know that these readiness components are in place, then we move on to developing supplier-specific relationship strategies. There are 3 steps involved in developing such strategies. First, the stakeholders who are impacted by services and products provided by the supplier need to be consulted. We might survey them to better understand their needs and their experience of a particular supplier, and then some we will ask to join a cross-functional team who will then develop the strategy. So we don't really want to do this strategy in procurement alone, because then there's a job of trying to sell it on to the stakeholder community, those that have been affected. Ideally, what we want to do is to make sure that we will involve them in the development of that strategy. So we want them on the team. Someone's asked a question to summarize supply-based segmentation once again. I will do that at the end if you don't mind. But essentially what I was saying is that you have to have a method of choosing which suppliers it's worth investing in for your most intensive effort. And that's way more than just the spend criteria, spend number. So I'll say more about that later on. So anyway, back to the SRM team. So that team is charged with analyzing all aspects of the relationship, including the category strategy itself. So we have to understand the wider supply market, and procurement, the category manager will be familiar with that, but not necessarily the stakeholders. Maybe we need to understand what people feel about the relationship on all sides. So surveying people around what their perceptions are around the relationship. Who has the power in the relationship? Who has the most leverage? Let's do some risk profiling and review past and current performance. And in addition, innovation potential and the scope for improving value and so on. So we really want to deeply understand the relationship before we start making judgments about what is the optimum way of engaging with them. And it's useful at this stage also to begin thinking about nominating a senior sponsor to each key relationship, because that will help signal the importance of this work and potentially remove roadblocks should efforts stall due to the lack of enthusiasm from the supply side or even from internal stakeholders. And then the strategy that emerges from that will have improvement projects identified from the relationship analysis. And these will be prioritized and scheduled out. And it will also define the methods of engagement that will follow. So let's talk about engagement. SRM, in my judgment, is about achieving as close as possible to the optimum value from the supply chain, the network, or ecosystem, however your organization defines it. And that value can be lost and it can be gained. So SRM must focus on minimizing the former and maximizing the latter. Therefore, supplier engagement consists of 3 levels of value management. Number 1, value protection, which is focused on contract risk and performance management. This is about getting what you contracted for. Every intervention to fix a delivery, a service, or a quality issue, or a miscommunication adds cost, erodes capacity, and then erodes also the expected value that you're going to get from the contract. So our teams need to be good at running supplier performance reviews, planning and scheduling those reviews, having the ability to corral stakeholders into participating, and of course providing updates to senior management as required. Although value protection is rarely the focus of much commentary around SRM, I think it's undoubtedly where the bulk of the day-to-day effort resides when it comes to supplier engagement. So it must not be underestimated when it comes to setting priorities. Level 2, which is dependent on being successful at level 1, consists of process improvement or value development. And sometimes in manufacturing circles, they call it supplier development. They've been calling that in the automotive sector, for instance, for the last 25 years and beyond. But this is essentially about working intensively with the supplier in identifying additional value. The degree of intervention here can be very intensive, even full-time deployment of experts in making improvements to the supplier's operating setup, and as such is resource hungry and not for everyone. For example, on a number of occasions I've had clients who've complained that despite their commitment to collaboration, the suppliers are less enthusiastic and it doesn't deliver, the program doesn't deliver expected improvements. So it soon becomes obvious that the buying organization has overestimated its ability to persuade and motivate the supplier, and that the supplier enjoys greater negotiating leverage in the relationship. So value development is, as I said earlier, is really not for everyone, has to be undertaken very carefully. And one word of warning, without the SRM team within the buying organization having genuine expertise and that which is valued by the supplier, you can expect suppliers to resist what they may see as interference. So smarter suppliers are unlikely to cough up savings and other benefits if they doubt your capability in helping them improve their operation. So there needs to be some real expertise here before you can start promising to transform a supplier's business to release more value. The third level, value transformation, this is the realm of supplier innovation, revenue growth, co-investment, and strategic alliances. These activities and outcomes require genuinely strategic relationships, and although they are maybe few in number, they can, if managed well, positively transform the organization's business model and really should be nurtured. Perhaps seen as a fashion, I think value transformation, as I've pitched it here, is seen as the fashionable end of SRM practice. So you get lots of people talking about supplier-enabled innovation, and you get pronouncements from the senior management team in the organization of fresh or new commitments to collaboration with suppliers, encouragement of innovation, and creating partnerships. All of these are very common. I'm making the case here for incrementalism. This approach only really works when value protection and value development have been successfully implemented. And think of it as a leaky bucket. You could do some really interesting things in innovation and value development with a key supplier, but if the day-to-day operational performance, the fulfillment part of the contract is not being managed well, the benefits that you think are accruing are dripping away from the bucket onto the floor. So what I presented up to this point is really focused on ensuring that procurement gets its act together. It develops a process with or without external help. It scales up its people, and it proactively engages key suppliers following an agreed strategy. This is not easy, and urgent priorities, budget cuts, semi-enthusiastic stakeholders, and uncooperative suppliers can all mess with the best intentions of the CPO. And it might just be one of the reasons why SRM has struggled in a lot of organizations to really catch on and embed. So to get SRM started or relaunched, I think leaders have three options. The first one is to highlight past and present operational and/or commercial failures due to inadequate SRM. You could portray value improvement opportunities based on reported benefits from external surveys, which in my experience range from anything from 1 or 2% on your aggregate procurement spend, which is well worth having, of course, right the way through to 20% and more from specific supplier relationships. It much depends on the intensity of your engagement. Or it could be a combination of one or two, the bad news versus the good news, whatever it takes to mobilize the organization to begin to take it seriously. Whichever approach is preferred, there's no doubt that a selling job needs to be done in the organization to secure support and investment for SRM. Yet even when a strategy is clear, organizations do struggle in implementing them. Those of you who will be familiar with Kaplan and Norton, the researchers who developed the balanced scorecard, they reported that 70% of strategies fail in the execution phase. And you've also got Bain and Company. They're even more pessimistic. They declare that only 9% of companies achieve what they set out to do. So getting the strategy right is really, really important. And that's why I said at the very beginning, it's about the capacity and the competence of the organization effectively to be able to implement the strategy. Otherwise, things just won't stick. So what makes a difference when it comes to SRM? Well, an approach to making SRM a success requires a change strategy systematically from first an overarching purpose. What is the organization seeking to achieve? And this, in my experience of working with many clients over recent years, is not always clear. Then there's the consideration of stakeholder needs, financial performance, SRM practice and methods, and finally skills. The very best organizations, or to be fair, those that have embedded SRM into day-to-day practice, have true clarity when it comes to why and how they're implementing SRM. Starting with the overarching purpose, this, as I've just mentioned, is not always so clear. Like many businesses, there are many business practices, there are SRM programs out there that lack a clear enough definition of what they're trying to achieve. This risks leaders and stakeholders remaining unconvinced, and confidence can ebb away from the procurement team. CPOs and the team struggle to articulate why investment is being made into SRM in the first place. To break through this logjam, I suggest CPOs should be able to clearly state the purpose of SRM's contribution to the business. So our definition of SRM, and this is just an example, there are others out there that are all good, but Mars is that SRM is the deliberate pursuit and the systematic management of post-contract value from the organization's key supplier relationships. It's deliberate, it's systematic, and the focus is on what happens after the contract has been signed. I hope it's clear that this definition doesn't declare one way or the other of working with suppliers. It doesn't lay it out. Anyone with experience will know that different relationships respond to different approaches. The collaboration works beautifully in some circumstances and less so in others. The successful SRM practitioner is able to diagnose which approach is likely to be most effective depending on the relationship circumstance. That's the relationship analysis that I mentioned earlier. This approach can be very effective in ensuring that the strategy for an SRM program or even a procurement transformation program can be demonstrably more robust, more connected to the organization and focused than simply adopting an approach to supplier management based on a desire to collaborate, perhaps copied from other organizations or another business sector. So my recommendation to CPOs is to articulate the purpose of SRM for your organization in a way that makes sense to everyone, and that it's a call to action, a compelling vision and a strapline that makes it clear why you're doing it. That's going to come in really helpful and handy when stakeholders get distracted with other priorities. Maybe their support will begin to waver, or they will complain that progress is not as smooth or as rapid as they expected. So let's talk a little bit more about those stakeholders. These are the customers of the SRM process. And I think the CPOs need to answer the what's in it for me question for every stakeholder constituency in the organization, because they don't all want or would benefit from the same thing from SRM. So, and these just are 4 examples you can see on the screen right now. So finance want the numbers, of course. They want savings and extended payment terms if they can get it. Operations want fast and reliable supplier responses. Design or engineering want supplier innovation, ideas and engagement with their new product or services pipeline. Marketing wants suppliers to provide something worth spending campaign money on. Quality assurance want compliance and maintenance of standards and specifications. And of course, senior management want the whole enterprise to provide a favorable return on investment. The key will always be to what extent does SRM demonstrably contribute to the success of each group of stakeholders? How can it make their work easier and better, as well as the organization as a whole? And this demands a kind of modified messaging to each of those stakeholder groups. So, you know, you can wax lyrical about innovation and collaboration going on with a particular supplier, but if you're talking to the CFO, they can easily get distracted by saying, well, look, where's the money? So we have to be thinking about what is the best combination of messages that we send out and share with our internal colleagues so that we can keep them involved and keep them enthused about all the good things that we're intending doing. So my suggestion is for CPOs to develop a tailored value proposition for each stakeholder group, as I just mentioned. Do with numbers if possible. Obviously, you don't want to go over the top and promise the earth, but in my experience, it's more pragmatic to build steadily with projects of modest size or a phased rollout. But you must keep in mind the needs of those stakeholders. One word of caution is to be careful about imposing top-down targets on the procurement team, and maybe I should be talking to a finance audience right now. Experience tells me that value for money improvements from SRM are emergent. There are so many types of SRM intervention, you don't know what value is achievable until you begin to lift up the rocks or mine for it. Once you understand which SRM practices work in a particular situation, then it will be progressively easier to pre-estimate future benefits and maybe put something in the budget. But you've got to be careful. At the beginning, it's a bit of a guessing game. From ends to means. So this is about how you do it. So following the development of a clear purpose and considering the impact on stakeholders' businesses, then the focus shifts from the means of delivery. Well, I've already discussed the SRM process and I don't want to labor it here, and I've touched upon skills development too. Structure also matters, and it's at this point when technology enablement should be considered. Applications supporting everything from supplier performance management to improvement project tracking are available, including from Zycus. The 2 solutions available from Zycus are iPerform to manage supplier performance and iSupplier for supplier onboarding. So following this webinar, you will, I understand, be redirected to the page where you can seek any more information on the Zycus applications. But that's about it from me. I just want to summarize before we take some questions. There's been a lot to take in during this webinar, and I hope you found it useful in mentally benchmarking your organization's readiness to deploy SRM. I discussed readiness criteria or the components that underpin readiness, the skills required to ensure stakeholders and suppliers, as well as being able to strategize and then oversee and manage project implementation. I talked about what an SRM process looks like, including what to focus on during the engagement phase, the protection, the development, and the transformation. And it's all about kind of rising to the challenge of managing a change program or a transformation program to ensure that SRM can become not only an interesting and productive part of the procurement role, worthy of investment and resource deployment, but it also delivers real tangible benefits to the business. It's not always easy. I mean, I think that's why we see SRM programs being relaunched by organizations that have tried it a couple of times already. There's something about SRM that puts it in the difficult box for some organizations. But if done well, it can make a huge difference to the procurement role and how it's seen by the business. And with that, I will wish you luck, and I'll now happily take questions.
Okay. David, we have a question. The question is, how long does it take to begin to see the benefits from SRTM?
I'm afraid the answer is how long is a piece of string, but let me just say it is not as quick as doing a sourcing negotiation, where you can easily go to an existing supplier and renegotiate prices and get that done in a matter of days and weeks. So I think maybe a more sensible answer, nevertheless, is to suggest that really you have to start thinking about developing a strategy for the key supplier relationships and then begin to engage with them in a more intensive way. And realistically, that's going to take several months before you start to see the benefits of that. So it's one of the reasons why I caution people to be kind of a little bit pragmatic when it comes to declaring what the benefits are going to come from SRM. You don't want to go out and say, well, you know, Ford Motor Company have been doing this and they've yielded 10% savings over the last 12 months. I'm sure if we just copy what they do, we'll find something the same. It doesn't work like that. So we have to look at our own individual circumstances, but I would still say nevertheless a few months.
Okay. And we have another question. Should procurement lead every key supplier relationship, or should stakeholders sometimes take the lead?
I think it depends, and the distinction I will draw, there is a little bit of a blurred line between the two, but I think it's not a bad place to start. In my judgment, if you're a procurement organization that is managing direct material inputs, which would be in a manufacturing setting, then it's normal for procurement, the leadership, to be delegated to procurement. But if you're in the indirect space, and particularly if you're sourcing services, then the active involvement and leadership of key stakeholders is likely to be more beneficial. But I like to see a combination in any organizational setup where you've got stakeholders really taking the game to key suppliers to drive improvement and not leaving it all to procurement.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for these insights, David. I'm sure our attendees have had a wonderful time listening to you and this setting up for the supply relationship management. You guys, if you have any questions for us, even later, you can always get back to us, email it to us, and we will forward them to David, and we will answer all your queries. And thank you so much for attending this webinar. We hope to see you again for our next webinar that we'll be conducting. Thank you so much.